So I've been accused of making unfounded accusations. In other words, making that whole video that I did and accusing YWAM of something but not being specific enough about what I was accusing. And so, yeah, I guess I don't feel like I have to make this video. I don't feel like I have to explain myself, because I did say in the video that wasn't the purpose of the video. I made it very clear. If you want to do the research, you can do that. I even linked the video below, the video below in the description of the last video of what spiritual abuse is, because people were asking, well, what is spiritual abuse? You can't just throw that word around. Well, I'm not an expert. I'm not here to educate. I'm not here to educate you on what spiritual abuse is. I don't think I even could if I tried. I would totally butcher it. That's why I put people, I gave a resource from someone who obviously is like way more informed than I am and knows how to explain it better than I ever could. Like I said, that was not the purpose of my video. I was trying to get the word out by making my video, by adding a resource to a platform where there weren't any, like YouTube. There's plenty on the internet if you look, but I noticed that there was nothing on YouTube like that. And so I was just trying to get the word out so that people could go find those resources and know where to find them. And yeah, so I don't feel like it really is my job. I know, like, some people seem to think that it's somehow now my responsibility to explain detail for detail, like, everything that happened. I can't do that without telling my story in detail, and I don't feel comfortable doing that. I tried to give as many details as I could and tell my personal story, but I can't get too specific about it because, this is a public platform. This is my story. This is personal to me. It involves other people, and I don't feel like that is appropriate. I've had so many people tell me, you're just using I and me, and this is just your perspective, and this is just your story, and you can't speak on behalf of everybody. And I don't try to speak on behalf of everyone. I'm speaking, though, I think, like, on behalf of a lot of people, not just myself. Like, yes, I am telling this just from my perspective, but I represent a lot of people on this topic, because I've had countless people messaging me saying, were we on the same outreach? Like, literally somebody said that to me today. She was like, I just watched your video, and word for word, it could not have been more accurate to my experience. And I hear that literally every single day, all the time, from so many different people. So I may be speaking for myself, but I do represent a large group of people who feel the same way. I can tell a bit of my story here and there. So one thing was that going into it, I knew my tendency to be sometimes overly critical, and so I was like, you know what, I want to get the most out of this experience. It's taken a lot for me to get here. I spent a lot of money on this. I want to get the most out of it. I don't want it to be a waste. So I, determined within myself that I would be as open as I could, but that ended up coming back and kind of biting me in the butt, because I think I accepted too many things that I should have actually been more critical of and more careful about, because it wasn't just for that reason that I stated earlier, but there were other reasons as well. Like, I think a lot of people would resonate with this. You're kind of being pressured and encouraged to do things that and even say things and behave a certain way, and a lot of it's not explicit, it's more like implied, and but it's still there, it's still very much there, and that's why it's called, that's why spiritual abuse is subtle. It's not always so like black and white or obvious. And that's why people have a hard time recognizing it for the longest time and pointing it out and saying, okay, that's not okay, because it's just, and that's why I say it's brainwashing. It's happening to you without you giving permission for it. And that happens through a number of ways. Their authority is equal to God's. Their word is equal to God's. They will speak on behalf of God for you, saying, I have a word from God for you. And if you don't like it, well, then you're questioning God. And how dare you question God? And if you don't agree with their authority, then how dare you question God's authority, essentially. And this whole thing of like, submit because you don't know who God's anointed are, and they use like Saul and David as an example of that, how Saul was God's anointed, but he was a horrible king and he was abusive to David, but David just, gave into it and he didn't challenge it because Saul was God's anointed. And they use that as an analogy to say, even if your leader asks you to do something, they tell you this before you leave for outreach, even if your leader asks you to do something that is wrong, you do it anyway, and they'll be held accountable, not you. It's just like there's a lot of fear that comes out of that, especially on outreach, when you don't trust your leader's integrity, and you're like kind of in between a rock and a hard place in deciding between going with what you know to be right, and even like what the Holy Spirit is telling you, or submitting. And if you don't submit, then you're putting yourself in a really, really hard position. And like even on my outreach, there was one time where our team was asked to do something that would put another family's life at risk, and we told them straight up, we're not going to do it. The entire team kind of like put our foot down and agreed that like until we handled it in the appropriate way, we weren't going to go along with it. And I mean, they had no choice but to consent, because we just weren't gonna budge. I wrote a while ago when I was like trying to process everything, I said, I felt like I'd finally grasped what the life of a believer was supposed to look like. Group worship every day, community all the time, serving others through hospitality, and literally sitting in lectures every day learning about Jesus and missions. It wasn't really until outreach that I realized I was living in a false sense of reality, and my whole perspective was shattered. Lecture phase was like living in a bubble. Outreach was being in the real world again. It was real life. We had to make our case, present our truth to normal people who hadn't gone through the training we'd gone through. I felt exposed. I began to get frustrated with how little the things I just started to learn actually made sense when I brought them out into the light. A lot of things we were taught sounded good in theory but didn't work in practice. I started to get really confused. I just started to accept all these beliefs, and now I felt like I had to abandon them. I was completely overwhelmed with the idea of having to start all over again from scratch. I knew that not 100% of the things I learned were false. I just needed to somehow separate the truth from the BS. But there was so much, and it was all so intricately intertwined that I didn't even know where to begin. On lecture phase, application was more optional, and outreach application was shoved down my throat. The lens through which they teach you to view life and to do life is so subjective. How do you live life with a mindset that someone else hearing God has authority in anyone's life but their own? Because something I found to happen quite often was people would both hear from God at the same time, but hear completely contradicting things. And then, you have to take a step back and examine and be like, okay, now, like, what do you do with that? We can't both be hearing from God, obviously. Or even if we would hear things that just didn't work for what we were doing, then we would re-pray until God gave us something that fit our agenda. And this would happen all the time. We'd, have a meeting and then we talk and be like, hey, well, obviously nobody heard anything good or useful, so we're going to re-pray. And I just felt like this whole way of living was just so like, instead of us just using wisdom and discernment, it was like so flippant and unreliable and just not realistic at all. So this is one story I wrote that gives an example of this. There was one night we were told the next day we were going to lead a church service and needed to pray about what to speak about. Different people heard conflicting things about how we were supposed to lead the service. There was a whole dispute that lasted over an hour. I just sat back and watched how ridiculous everyone was acting. Then our contact came and asked if he could speak to our leader in private. When she came back, she looked completely bewildered and even almost embarrassed. She told us we wouldn't be leading the church service after all. The next day, the exact same thing happened, literally. They told us we were going to pray all over again for the church service. I was so annoyed that I asked why we wouldn't just do everything we'd planned the night before, since we'd spent so much time planning it, and people had apparently heard from God. My leader told me it was because God had spoken about that service, and since this was for another day, maybe the congregation for this service would be different. Being a very theologically minded person, I literally said to her in front of the whole team, that makes no sense. The service we prayed for was never going to happen. God knew that before we did. He wouldn't have given us a word for a service He knew we'd never attend. If that doesn't start to confuse a reasoning person, then I don't know what would. I felt like I had to leave my brain at the door a lot of days when we were doing things because it was so overly spiritualized, so overly dependent on people's visions and word from the Lord that none of us could, back up with scripture or anything like that. And so we're just, doing things completely trusting that what they heard was right, but so many times it was proven that it wasn't. A prime example of this was, let me see if I have the story actually. Okay, here it is. Our last ministry night, we were sitting around a table outside having dinner, discussing what we were going to do for our last night. This was in Papua New Guinea, in a village in the Highlands. And we'd been in Papua New Guinea for about a month and on outreach for about 2. So this was a few days before we got to go back to debrief. Everyone looked dead. When we went around telling how we were doing, every single person admitted to being emotionally numb and ready to go home. We were struggling. It was one of the most depressing moments of my life. I've never felt anything like it. Before that night, people had done a good job of putting on a happy face and pretending to be okay even when they weren't, just to get through it. But that night was different. As we made plans for another empty service, I felt my heart start racing and my palms sweating, and I knew that was a sign I was about to say something controversial. When everyone was done talking, I asked if I could say something. They all just looked at me funny. I was shaking, but I told them the reason we were all burnt out and feeling so restless was because we just kept doing the same thing night after night, and deep down we knew it was no good. I watched the kids fall asleep on each other and the adults trying to outdo each other and nodding and making grunting noises to appear like they understood everything we were saying when it was obvious they weren't, by how they wouldn't always respond at the appropriate moment or even wait for the translator. There was a spirit of religiosity here, and we were feeding it. I commented about how at least half of our audience was young children and explained how all the memories I have that I can see Jesus in the most, the moments I felt God the clearest in my life from my childhood, weren't from church services or sermons. They were from moments of fellowship, town events, and family reunions. I recommended that on our last night we have a bonfire and play games, something to wake everyone up. They decided the bonfire was a good idea, but they still wanted to do the service as usual because people had heard from God that we were supposed to. I felt successful in my compromise. We even made damper dough that we rolled in cinnamon and sugar for them to cook over the fire. We got to the plot of land where the service was supposed to be held that night, and they carried us in for a ceremony of dancing and singing. When they were finished, the first girl who was scheduled to speak went to the middle of the circle of people where the lights were shining on her and began yelling so everyone could hear. She hadn't said more than a few words before out of nowhere the sky opened up and it began to pour rain. People started taking shelter under the huts, and the lights began to flicker and go out. The girl kept yelling, but no one could hear her over the rain. I think they were waiting for it to let up so we could resume, but it didn't. It only got worse. We ended up being taken to someone's porch and given bread and some kind of hot beverage. Everyone looked happier and more alive than they'd looked in a long time. They all said this is what we thought outreach would be like. Moments like these, where plans were ruined and memories are made. To this day, I don't think the rain was a coincidence. It ended up being the best night of our whole time there, and we still got to have the bonfire, but no service.
I remember actually thinking on my outreach, I don't know anything. I wanted to literally wipe my brain completely clean and start from scratch because I had so many conflicting thoughts going on in my head, so many things that were there, that were planted there by YWAM, that I knew when I broke them down and when I applied them on outreach, I was like, this is not right. I don't agree with this, but it's like it's there and I can't get it out. And a lot of it's like language too, because YWAM has like their lingo that they use and whatever, and I don't know, I felt like a lot of things, a lot of like actual solid teachings were kind of ruined for me, just because of being overused in YWAM or used out of context or taken too far. And now I just like, when I hear those terms, which may be, totally biblical or totally like fine in and of themselves, I can't hear them without like putting a wall up. I just have learned how to maybe be overly cautious when I'm being told this is truth or this is what God's saying, and I don't even know anymore like what I believe about a lot of things that I used to be very confident in. So this is something I wrote the other day that might kind of help people to understand what it's like in the brain of someone who has gone from being gone through thought reform and is coming out of it, like people who leave YWAM and have to reprogram their brain after leaving. So I wrote this: coming out of it is one of the hardest processes because you have to essentially reprogram your brain. There's a lot of fear that results from that, because when you start to actually see how manipulated you were and realize how they did it, you start to wonder if you can even trust yourself anymore, because no one thinks they're susceptible to brainwashing. We all say that could never work on me. Then when you realize it does, you become obsessively skeptical and suspicious of everything. It's enough to drive anyone mad, constantly being on guard like that. So that's what happened to me when I came back, because I didn't even want to have these conversations with people because I felt like my mind was abused. I felt like I had lost control of my own mind, what goes in and comes out, and you realize when this happens to you, when you're coming out of it, you realize how little control you actually have over your own mind. And that's so scary, because you think, oh, I'd be stronger than that. You think, oh, that stuff would never work on me. I'm stronger than that. I never in a million years dreamed that I would be one of those people who would be influenced by that. And when I read back through my journal entries from the first few months of my DTS, I'm literally embarrassed by how gullible I was. And I don't know, it's just terrifying, because it's like, if it happened once, then who's to say it couldn't happen again and again and again and again. And yeah, now I recognize the patterns, and I can be more aware of what that looks like, but it's still really scary, because you just feel like you have to be on guard all the time, and you put up this protective mechanism, and there's fear, literally just so much fear that comes out of that. And that's what makes people so afraid to go back to church after leaving YWAM, There's so many stories of people who literally cannot step foot in a church, which is so heartbreaking. But it's like, I don't know, like you just don't even know anymore. Like, you don't know yourself anymore.
I'm going to link below because I don't want to delve into that whole thing right now, but there are 8 points of thought reform by Robert J. Lifton that are used by psychologists to determine whether someone has been subject to cult behavior or whatever. And when I go through, I want you to read them for yourself, but when I read these 8 criteria, I was shocked at how many of them resonated with my experience with YWAM. And some of them need to be more analyzed. It's not as blatant when you first read it, but some of them were so strikingly like similar to things that I saw and experienced in YWAM that I was like, how is nobody talking about this? This is crazy. One of them, I think it's point 4 maybe, is called confession. And it literally just describes like the way that YWAM views openness and brokenness. Like if you've ever done a DTS, you've done an openness and brokenness night where you stand in front of everybody and confess your deepest, darkest secrets and whatever. And like you're taught that unless you do this publicly, you can never really like heal from these things or whatever, heal from these things in your past. And that's obviously not true. I was always very cautious and skeptical about this handle of confession because we did it very often. These days would go on. If you don't know anything about this, our openness and brokenness ministry day lasted about 12 hours. We were there until like late into the night. I think we had to skip lunch, so a mandatory fast, which was also not uncommon for the base to do. And I've heard that that's pretty common for bases in general to do mandatory fasts, or at least for schools, which is another issue in its own entirely. But yeah, so my opinion on that is that can be even more traumatizing, and that some of those things I thought in the moment should not have been shared outside of a therapist's office because they were so intricately personal and even traumatic, and did not need to be shared in front of a group of 50 strangers, quite frankly. There were a lot of stories that I also talked about in my last video, or the first video, and I don't want to like make this video any longer by reiterating those. So these are just things that I didn't mention before, and just a way to give a little more context to my story. Again, I can't like just go off about every single thing that I feel was wrong, but that's why I've provided the other resources, and I will continue to do that in the description below.